Welcome to the Learning to Die podcast.
I'm Ian Doonican.
And I'm Kieran O'Regan.
How do I live when I know I must die?
We explore areas of philosophy, psychology, martial arts, culture, existential risk, history, society, religion, science, and anything else that seems of interest and relevance to answering that question.
We can only hope that some of what we learn might be of benefit to you too. Namaste, sapiens. All right. Stephen.
Testing, yeah. Is that all right?
I think we're all good, yeah?
Yeah.
The microphone's on, we're sitting upright, it's a good day. So yeah, once your 2 feet hit the ground, it's a good day. Stephen, thanks very much again for doing this podcast with me this morning here at ECU up in Joondalup. I'm really looking forward to this because your research, whilst it mightn't be classic sleep research or philosophy type research that I might be interested in, it caught my eye a number of weeks ago. So I didn't know about you till about maybe 2 months ago when I contacted you, and I read this kind of clickbait headline about microdosing and yoga, and I was like, oh, what's this? Clicked on it. I was like, oh, this is really interesting. Someone's actually looking at the different effects of microdosing versus yoga and combined. And myself and my friend Kieran O'Regan in Ireland were talking about the differences or the similarities between DMT and meditative states. So I proceeded to read the abstract. And like any good academic, I deduced from the abstract what's going on. And so I made a heap of assumptions about what was happening. But then I went, oh, I wonder what the lead author's name is. Stephen Bright, he's in Joondalup. Oh, at ECU, I have an adjunct position there. And then I was talking to Amanda Devine, and Amanda goes, Stephen, yeah, he just sits out there somewhere. You should go and see if he's around. I was like, I don't even know what he looks like. So I got your email address and contacted you, and here we are having a chat.
Here we are.
So yeah. So Stephen, for people who don't know you, including myself really, what's your background in terms of education, where you're from, and how did you get to this position here today?
Well, I actually did my undergraduate studies in psychology, minoring in addiction studies, which is what the course I coordinate now. I then did postgraduate work at Curtin University. I did a combined PhD and Masters in Clinical Psychology there.
Oh, yeah.
And then headed over to Melbourne, worked as a psychologist over there for about 15 years, and then transitioned back to the current role I'm in at ECU. So I've spent most of my career working in a clinical background rather than a research background, but I've always had an interest in research. So I've been publishing papers since 2007, and my research has moved from everything through from looking at behaviour change and obstacles that get in the way of behaviour change through to specific populations like older adults and their interactions with alcohol and other drugs. And I guess new and emerging drugs became an interest in around 2013, 2014. And also around that time, I became interested in psychedelic drugs and became aware of an incredible renaissance in science with regard to psychedelics that was occurring, and it was just a fluke really. I was at a conference in Melbourne and they had a number of presenters from overseas. They had presenters from Johns Hopkins University talking about one of the first studies on psilocybin that had been done since the prohibition of psilocybin, and it just really opened up my conscious to all of this research that had been going on that I wasn't aware of at that time. And then I got invited to come back to their second conference and do a keynote, just a summary of psychedelic science. And Rick Doblin was at that conference.
He's the guy from MAPS.
Correct.
Yeah.
And he's a very charismatic fellow. And he got us all together at the end of the conference and said, you've seen the data from our first phase 2 clinical trial of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD. Why don't you guys replicate that here in Australia? Now, that was back in 2010, 2011, and it's taken us 10 years to get to the point of almost recruiting a participant to a clinical trial for MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. So the primary area of my research at the moment is trying to get those clinical trials up with MDMA. But in the meantime, while I've been at ECU, because of my interest in psychedelics, I've become a bit of a beacon for students that want to do research on psychedelics. And I'm more than happy to supervise them if we can come up with a project that fits within the scope of what they're doing, whether it's honours, PhD, masters. and is going to make some sort of contribution to the international psychedelic science renaissance.
So if somebody was listening to this and they were like, well, what do you mean by psychedelics? Because they hear psychedelics is used interchangeably. People look at art and go, it's psychedelic. I had this psychedelic experience. It's psychedelics is just for a bunch of hippies who sit around. It's just a kind of for want of a better word, a bullshit term that people come up with.
It's a loaded term.
Yeah, it's got lots of different kind of, avenues into it, if you want to say.
It's got a lot of connotations. Yeah. And I use it purposefully. I use the term psychedelics because I want to take back that term. And, if you go back to the 60s and 70s when psychedelics were banned, it became a tainted term back then. Since then, a lot of the drugs that I examine have been named hallucinogens, and I don't like that term because I think it's pathogenic. People don't have true hallucinations when they've taken a psychedelic drug. They have altered states of consciousness, but they don't have true hallucinations. So I don't think that's particularly helpful. Another term that sort of emerged on the fringes is entheogen. So an entheogen is a substance that that creates the divine within. And of course, nobody's heard of it, so I don't use that term either. So instead, I tend to embrace this term psychedelics because most people have heard of it, and it might have those negative connotations. Yeah. And by continuing to use it in the context of science, I'm hoping to create some positivity with regard to those connotations. And so when we talk about psychedelics, it is a fairly broad term. There's sort of the classic psychedelics like dimethyltryptamine, DMT, psilocybin or 4-hydroxydimethyltryptamine, lysergic acid, diethylamide, LSD. They're the classic psychedelics. And then there's things that don't fit nicely into the psychedelic category, things like ketamine, ibogaine, even MDMA is really not a psychedelic. It's more of an empathogen. An empathogen and entactogen. It creates a sense of empathy between people,
like an openness.
It opens the heart, if you like. Yeah. So it's not really a psychedelic. So I use the term psychedelic very loosely because of those reasons of wanting to own the term and try to change the way that we use the term within our culture. But even within psychedelics, when you start getting scientific about it, there are the classic psychedelics, and then there are sort of psychedelic-like drugs.
So it'd be fair to say you can have a psychedelic category of drugs, but then you can have psychedelic experience, which could be from drugs or from meditation, yoga, getting hit in the head with a shovel, whatever it might be, whatever your path to that state is, you could have a psychedelic experience devoid of the actual drug itself.
Yeah, you could have a spontaneous psychedelic experience. So, you mentioned DMT. Rick Strassman's talked about people having experiences where they believe they've had alien encounters, and he believes that that's due to endogenous release of dimethyltryptamine. So they haven't taken anything exogenously, they haven't consumed any drug, but they're having some sort of psychedelic experience in which they're having contact with entities. And you can have an epileptic fit in a particular part of the brain that leads you to the temporal lobe. It leads you to have a sort of psychedelic experience as well. So it can be brought on by substances, but it can be brought on by other means as well. And I think the psychedelic experience is part of a broader category of altered states of consciousness. So the state of consciousness that is achieved through ecstatic dancing or drumming or fasting, or many cultures have found different ways of inducing altered states of consciousness. Many of them have used psychoactive drugs to do it because it's the quickest and fastest way to get there. But there's lots of ways to alter one's state of consciousness.
I'm smiling here, Stephen, because I've spoken about this on this podcast and other podcasts as well. I used to do a lot of long distance running, like 100k runs up to 170. And I remember in some of the early ones, running in the Blue Mountains, I had this vision. Well, not even vision. To this day, I still think it was real, where I was in this valley and it was dark and I was running, but there was like brumbies, the horses running next to me. And I came out of the valley and I was like, man, there's loads of horses down there. And the people were like, there's no horses here. And I was like, no, there's fucking tons of like brumbies running. No. And I was like, oh man, I must be hallucinating. That was that sustained hours of wakefulness, being very tired, caloric deficit, same thing. All kind of led to that state. And then in America years ago, running at altitude for like 20 something hours, I was running with a wolf who was running beside me, and I was talking to him, and he was looking at me. He was my friend, but there was no wolf. So that same thing, like with no exogenous, intake of any substance, but it's just like you're saying, how you can get to those altered states of consciousness through that, or when people do long-term meditation, or yoga, or whatever it might be, or spend time without all that noise or in isolation, when they just kind of dial everything in, they seem to be able to have those experiences as well. So I think like if people have listened to Ram Dass, who was Richard Albert, who was one of these first original people who got kicked out of Harvard with Timothy Leary back in the 60s, the turn on, tune in, drop out phase. Whilst they were great at raising probably awareness around it, they were also the worst people as well, because they probably put the research back by 50 years, I think, in some ways. And you could comment more on that. But, Ram Dass was one of those guys that kind of, got catapulted to the moon straight away through having these experiences. But then he also went on the slow coach, and he went to India and got through it through meditation and yoga and other practices as well. So he kind of saw that duality, as did people like Jack Cornfield, Lama Soridas, who I forget his original name, but there's multiple people that have done that in the 60s and 70s, and just found different routes to the same.
I think what's happened there, on reflection now, with 50 years of knowledge and currently engaging in psychedelic assisted psychotherapies and looking at what works best in those therapies, I think that some of those individuals from the first wave of research were having difficulty integrating their psychedelic experience, and things like meditation can be a really useful way of integrating that and potentially getting to the same point. So there was an argument made, back when Timothy Leary was doing his work, by a philosopher that one shouldn't use psychedelics because it would be like taking a helicopter to the top of Mount Everest, topping off, having a look and flying back down. You need to climb the mountain. And so, even after these people like Ram Dass got a helicopter ride to the top, they still thought it was important to now go climb the mountain afterwards. And so, I think integration is been something that's sort of key that we've learned since that research was happening back then.
And what do you think, Stephen? Okay, let me actually, before I ask that question, I want to back it up, because some of your research papers I've read, and I'm not completely all over your literature, but like I said, that first paper that caught my eye, that objective here, and I'm just reading from the abstract, was the current study aimed to explore whether the subjective effects of microdosing psychedelics, which you just spoke about, are comparable to those of yoga in relation to psychological well-being, depression, anxiety, and stress. So general kind of common mental health, we'll say, for want of a better word for a moment. It also aimed to explore the relationship between yoga, microdosing, and personality variables, and including neuroticism, openness, and absorption. So, and absorption being, your kind of ability to enter these altered states of consciousness, not absorption as in taking up water. But if we look at this research paper here, and from some of the stuff I've read from your work, it's very aimed at mental health and well-being. Is that true? Am I getting that right from what the papers I've glanced at as well?
I would say 80 to 90% of my work is focused on a more pathological paradigm, in that we're looking at people who are unwell, that aren't responding to current treatments for their mental illness, and looking at whether MDMA or psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy might provide a cure, if you like, to their mental condition. Whereas 10 or 20% of my research is more focused on just the well-being, the idea that we live in a wellness culture. People are quite focused on wellness, and I think the phenomenon with microdosing, which is quite different to normally dosing psychedelics, in that you take a tenth of a dose, it's not actually meant to create a psychedelic experience at all. It's just meant to enhance performance, enhance well-being. So the microdosing stuff is really coming more from that well-being focus. And then at the same time, because I've become a bit of a beacon for people that want to talk about their psychedelic experiences, a lot of people will approach me and tell me about a psychedelic experience they've had at a retreat or wherever, and how significantly that's then improved their mental health or enhanced their well-being or something along those lines. So I get a lot of anecdotes from people, both who have experienced some positive effects from psychedelics leading to an improvement in their mental well-being, or enhancing their mental well-being and improving their well-being, from a point where they didn't have a mental health condition in the first place. They were just looking for something to make them even better.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Which I think, as a general term, which is in Buddhism and Stoicism, we're all kind of suffering, whether we're rich, poor, and whatever it might be. Everybody's got some level of suffering, and it's all kind of relative. So everybody's looking for some type of improvement in their life. Even probably people like Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. I'm sure people are crying now in sympathy.
What I find really interesting is there's been a real shift in celebrities seeking out psychedelic experiences. It was, only last night, I'm sure it was last night, I was just scrolling through YouTube and saw an interview with Megan Fox, who was talking about her ayahuasca experiences in Costa Rica that she'd had a couple of months ago. So I think more and more celebrities are seeking out these experiences as well.
Well, that was kind of the question I was going to ask you a moment ago. So Joe Rogan obviously has made this type of stuff mega. Stephen is squinting, looking at the ground here, right? Has made this stuff mega popular, right? And even before Rogan, so people will say to me, I'm on the bandwagon with Rogan. I'm not, because how I got to this was probably through the DMT thing being released by the pineal gland, which is very important in sleep, which is synchronized through the suprachiasmatic nucleus through light, which is used for jet lag and shift work disorders, where melatonin is secreted. Mm-hmm. I was aware of that research beforehand, and I was aware of Rick Strassman's work before even Rogan got on the bandwagon. And despite Joe Rogan saying that psychedelics would cure everything, even COVID, I got a warning on Facebook. I put up a joke saying one day, I'm not sure why people aren't smoking marijuana, because according to Joe Rogan, it will stop COVID, right, as a joke. And I got like a 24-hour ban and a warning for making a joke. But anyway, you can't argue with Facebook robots. They don't get humor. But do you think that in some ways that it may hinder the type of research, because so many celebrities are doing it because it might be kind of in vogue? It's cool to do. Everybody wants to go and see a shaman and go on an ayahuasca retreat to Brazil. People want to do a DMT dose. And so what it might do is actually bring us back to that kind of thing that Leary was doing in the 60s with some kind of minor celebrities himself. And will it bring us back, do you think?
Yeah, look, there's two things that keep me awake at night with regard to my research program. One of them is hype. And, you talked about Joe Rogan. Since Joe Rogan, Michael Pollan's released the book. Yeah. I mean, there's just and increasingly as more research results get released from research overseas, it's getting really positive publicity and media here in Australia. And it worries me that because we're so far behind in our research in Australia running these clinical trials, I must get 2 or 3 emails a week from people wanting to know how they can access these clinical trials in Australia. They've got treatment-resistant depression or post-traumatic stress disorder. They've tried everything, and it's very difficult for me. I have to just respond to them and say, look, thanks for reaching out. I'm really sorry, but at the moment we're not at a position where we can be taking on new participants. Then those people, that all these people that are being made aware of psychedelic assisted psychotherapy potentially being an effective treatment for particular mental conditions or mental health disorders, desperate people will do desperate things, and I'm worried that they will go out and source psychedelics illicitly, and then there's quality control, or they do it in a circle, in a ritualistic sort of setting in an urban environment. Again, we don't know exactly what the person's being provided. There's no regulation over ayahuasca circles in Perth or Sydney or Melbourne, so we don't know that people are being provided with the right space to be able to process that experience, potentially inadequate screening, so you end up with someone with bipolar disorder coming in, going into a manic episode. So a lot of that keeps me awake at night. And the flip side to that is that even with the clinical research that we're doing, it allows people to access these experiences within the context of a clinical setting with two co-therapists that are trained in how to deliver this treatment. If this then gets rolled out as a mainstream treatment, say tomorrow psilocybin was made a Schedule 8 controlled medicine, it would be very difficult still for people to access it. It would be extremely expensive, and it's not available in the public healthcare system. So people could be paying $10,000, $20,000 to do a legal psilocybin retreat for 2 nights. It's probably in Byron or somewhere. And why that keeps me awake at night is because the people that are coming through the clinical trials that we're doing at the moment are the people that need it most, and they're not going to be able to access it once we push it into a sort of commercial capitalist paradigm, which is what we're living within.
And do you think, Stephen, that people, do you have any sense or a feel for the data or from your experience about which types of socioeconomic groups would need it most? Is it more people who are unemployed, working class, who are struggling maybe in these areas, or is it more towards the middle classes, upper classes that need it, or is it a bit of a spread?
I think it's completely across the board. I think there's a bit of a myth, that Lyrian folks started back in the 50s and 60s, which was psychedelics will cure society. The problem is, and sort of Joe Rogan, I think you mentioned Joe Rogan, or something similar, psychedelics are going to fix everything. And they're not, because I don't think society still is ready to assist people integrate altered states of consciousness. Our Western culture is quite unique and abnormal in that way, in that we don't have a place for altered states of consciousness. So if anything, society needs to change first so that psychedelics have more of a place within society, and there's an opportunity for integration. But I don't think psychedelics are going to change society anytime soon. It's more that as we keep doing research and people are more exposed to these ideas, then it becomes more of an office water cooler conversation than at the moment, where it's still sort of underground to some degree. It's not something people are talking about publicly.
That's interesting that you say that, because if I think about just straight away about ayahuasca is, very South American focused in indigenous communities there around Brazil, Peru and so on. They have that whole ritualistic aspect to it, and it's part of their culture. If you look at peyote in the American Indian culture, same thing as well, or the use of sweat lodges. In the East, in Hinduism, lots of hashish around ashrams, but it'll be very integrated within yoga, the culture, the different gods that they have in Hinduism. I'm not so aware of lots of psychedelic usage in Buddhism. It's more meditative, long-term meditative states. Like, I interviewed Lama Soridas, who did a silent meditation retreat for 3 years, 3 months, 3 weeks, 3 days, and 3 hours. Only for he was a monk, I would have said the following words: "What the fuck?" Like, how do you, I've done a few weekend retreats, and even they were pretty hardcore. So I think it's interesting you said that. And also as well, I've done a couple of silent meditation retreats, like I said, and even when I went on those, I had to fill out declarations about my kind of background, was I diagnosed with any depression, mental health issues. And then even on a 3-day retreat, you had an interview with the I don't know what you want to call them, like the meditative leader, host, monk, whatever it might be, the kind of the retreat coordinator. So you would meet with them at least once, and they were a kind of psychological check to see if you're okay. So it's really important. That's in a setting in a retreat environment. Food and meals provided. It's a comfortable environment, so you're not going to be kind of attacked or you're in fear, or all that safety net is provided. Your phone, you don't use your phones, electronic devices, but you can go to somebody if you need to ring home or whatever. But in an ayahuasca circle, maybe up in the hills in Perth, you got no idea what's going on. Are you going to pass out for 2 days and be puking your guts up? Are people going to leave you? You're going to get robbed? You're going to get raped? You really don't know. And it sounds a bit extreme, but you're really just relying on the trust of the people in that circle, who also may be tripping at the same time. So that sort of setting and environment and context is really important, because we don't have it embedded in our culture, like you're saying.
Yeah,
it's really interesting.
I've actually seen the other side of the coin as well, which is those people who have had a psychedelic experience in the wrong mind state, in the wrong setting, and they've ended up with some serious mental health concerns after that. And I think it goes back to what you're saying, this idea of it not being integrated into our culture, where you compare it with those indigenous cultures where it is part of the culture. And for me, I think I know when our culture is more ready for integration of psychedelic experiences. It's when we move away from this reductionistic approach to treating mental illness or sleep or whatever it is that we're talking about. Where at the moment, there's the psychiatric biological model. Here, you've got depression. Take one of these for the rest of your life, and that will sort it out, because it's a chemical imbalance in your brain, or trauma, where we're trying to treat the symptoms often rather than what brought on the condition in the first place. And I think what those collective cultures that often use psychedelics do well is address the social determinants of what's causing mental illness in the first place. Because if you've got someone with depression and you even if you treat them with psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, if you put them back in the environment that was causing the depression in the first place, well, of course the depression is going to come back. Meditation's been shown to reduce relapse back to depression. But again, if you're putting somebody back into an environment where they're trying to look after 4 kids, hold down a job, they're struggling to pay the rent, food, all of these sorts of things. So a normal
family.
They're just going to continue to relapse. And with trauma, what you see is intergenerational trauma, particularly with Indigenous Australians. It's not... You'll see a 17-year-old that's in court that's done something horrific, but if you look through the family lineage, there's been trauma and mental illness and substance use going back from generation and generation and generation. So until we as a society figure out how we do better early intervention and we do sort of antenatal intervention, and we try to help mothers connect with babies, and we're doing some of those things already, but even that's too late. We need to go back further and try to fix what's happening before kids are even born. Early intervention needs to be so early. It needs to happen in the the mother and father's childhood themselves, so that it has a downstream effect to prevent mental illness.
As you're talking here, I'm thinking of lots of different things. You're thinking about epigenetics, you're talking about time of conception. I'm starting to think about the adverse child experience outcomes, those questionnaires, and how they predict like the future life of somebody, and then that intergenerational, like you said. I'm also thinking about work like from Carl Jung or Jordan Peterson, where they talk about basically we don't have these, or other societies, we don't have these like rituals as we grow up. We don't have these kind of toll gates, particularly for men as we get older, where we kind of feel like we're becoming something. It's kind of this, becoming a man is a bit like getting a PhD, I think. I don't know if you felt like this, but when I got my PhD, it wasn't so much like, wow, you've done your PhD. It was like this slow fizzle. It's done now. You sit there waiting for comments. You get it back. It's kind of like, well, is it done? Is it not done? Yeah, okay, all right, okay, it's done. Graduation. It's kind of this long, slow fizzle out. And becoming a man from kind of 15, 16, right through till 21, it's this slow kind of fizzle. There doesn't seem to be this kind of toll gate where you go through initiation where you see in some other cultures as well. I think that might be missing too from a male perspective.
I absolutely agree, and I think the one ritual we do have, our manhood ritual, I'm not sure if this is worldwide or just in Australia, but when you turn 18 or 21, you get pissed.
Exactly.
You get
exactly.
shit-faced. To the point where, your friends might play some pranks on you, or, you throw up. But the rituals that we do have in our culture are not particularly healthy rituals, but we still sort of buy into that. But we don't have the sort of rituals, that bring us to bring us together as a community. Rather it's just get shit faced. That's our manhood ritual.
And I think you're right. Look, it can be a bit of fun when you're young, but I think long term it's not good. And I think, as you were saying that, I was thinking about when I was younger in my teenage years. That's why I smoked, even though I was mad into rugby and sport and all that, and I was very healthy. I also, the duality of that was I wanted to smoke to look older, and this was in the early 90s. I wanted to be like, If you smoked, you're older. If you had a part-time job, you were older. Like I had a part-time job in a bar, and I was like, all right, I smoked, had a part-time job in a bar. I was streets ahead of my, 15-year-old compadres, I was just completely different and having a drink. So you're right, it's all of those kind of markers that show us moving into adulthood and as men, which they're fun and they're good in some ways. But you're right, I think overall we don't have these kind of toll gates in society where other cultures have them. And I think it's something that is missing. And I think when you look at, people wonder why Jordan Peterson is so popular these days with particularly men. I think that's why he's appealing to that in men, where we've lost that. And I know people will be probably listening to this going, Jordan Peterson, an asshole. He hates transgender people. He says whatever. And maybe you're right, maybe you're wrong. I don't know. But I think that's why he has that appeal, because he's hitting those people who have kind of lost their way. And I think that's why the danger coming back to the psychedelics is some people then might grasp at psychedelics as the answer to change that. And they might go down a very dark path, as you said. So they might be like, right, well, I'm not going to drink, but I'm going to just do heroic doses, as Rogan would say, or Terence McKenna. And I've listened to a lot of Rupert Sheldrake lately. I don't know if you listen to Rupert Sheldrake. He's quite interesting with his morphic resonance theory, but I've gone back listening to some of his early work with Terence McKenna and somebody else who I can't recall. And those guys, it's like, well, really, is that really the way to go? But I find maybe that people do that when they're younger, and as they get older, then they move more towards, what did you call it? Like the inside, what was it? Ontological?
Entheogen.
Entheogen. So that more kind of connectivity with the divine, or trying to look for a true, more religious or meditative experiences as people get older, as opposed to just getting, the rocket ship to the moon, doing these big doses. So it's kind of, it's interesting, all these things at play. We're having a very open conversation here. We're not giving much clarity, but it's interesting because it's such a new area. It's really an exploratory conversation about all these ideas converging, I think.
Yeah, look, a couple of things that stand out just in what you've said. One is Australia, and I think probably the Western society more broadly, is becoming more and more of a non-secular society, and so people are looking for different ways to connect, not just with each other, but with whatever it is, that transcendental experience. And so we've seen an increase in New Age spiritual beliefs, where people just sort of pick and choose bits and pieces and bring that together to create some sort of belief system that sits well with them. That's people looking for that connection with a greater being, or
we'll call it the divine.
Whatever it is. People are looking for that because they're turning away from the traditional churches where people would get that, and people would also get sort of the community stuff there as well. On top of that, in addition to the sort of manhood rituals we're talking about, within Australia, the culture of alcohol consumption is about drinking large quantities frequently. If you look at binge drinking is a big part of Australian culture. Yeah. And so what I often see when I do harm reduction work at festivals is people trying to apply that culture to the use of other drugs. So taking those heroic doses of psilocybin mushrooms, or too much MDMA, or too much LSD, or whatever it is, but they're trying to apply that culture of and I don't have a nicer way of saying it, but Australians like to get fucked up, and whether that's getting fucked up with alcohol, or whether it's MDMA, or whether it's LSD, they try to use that same model. And where it shifts away from, trying to have a good time with it, which can go pear-shaped, which is what I often see in harm reduction services, where people are having a challenging time, or what people would call a bad trip, through to having an intention to use the substances in a way that's having some sort of value for you as an individual, be that in terms of understanding your own self and creating insight, or addressing a particular pattern of behavior that you engage in, or including smoking. I mean, there's been a lot of research demonstrating that psilocybin, and this was happening in the 50s with alcohol. They were using LSD to treat alcohol dependence. So it's very good at shifting those patterns of behavior. And if you think of thinking as a pattern of behavior, that's probably why it works so effectively psilocybin works so effectively for treating treatment-resistant depression. It's because it's changing those ways of thinking about oneself, the future, and others. But to do that, one has to have the intention has to be there. I almost said right intention, but it's just an intention is there, whereas the intention most people have when they're using recreationally is just to get fucked up.
Yeah, and I often wonder as well, because in some of my research, we collect data using the World Health Organization auditude for alcohol consumption. We collect, obviously, lots of data around sleep, whether it be in athletes or whether it be in shift workers. And one of the surprising kind of, contributing factors that we always find is the high levels of obesity, which is a precursor to sleep apnea, for example. High levels of obesity and overweight, probably 70%, and at least half of the population that we sample in every group binge drinking behavior to hazardous levels. So I'm like, is this because people are so unfulfilled that they just consume this like vast quantities of alcohol and it's like you said, like just gonna get fucked up? And then when they're not doing that, they're doing it with food. So they're seeking pleasure in different ways or alleviation of suffering because they can't take that step back and look at their behavior. I used to think like up until a few months ago that type of behavior was just weakness, that people were just weak of mind because they drank so much and didn't have discipline. For me it was very kind of like a military approach, like just be disciplined, stop drinking so much, stop eating so much, set parameters. If you go over X amount of kilos, fucking stand up straight, get your shit in order and get on with it, because that's the way I treat myself. But that's not going to be applicable for everybody, because I've really started to change how I think on that, because I think, maybe people are in a bad situation. That's the only pleasure they get. Maybe they're seeking that's 20 minutes of pleasure. That's the equivalent of me like watching, I don't know, Game of Thrones with a ginger beer going, whoa, how good was that? That's their equivalent for them. So I think maybe potentially because we lack that in the community, we might be jumping to those things. And then to your point as well, Steve, about people moving away from churches, are we losing that community or that sangha, as they say in Buddhism, that collective group where people are more fending for themselves and therefore these things are increasing, like this suffering?
Well, I think Johan Hari says it best when he says the opposite to addiction is not sobriety, it is connection. And so the reason people are engaging in these behaviours is to connect in some way, or that they're filling a void. One of the things we've learned about addictive behaviour is it's not about changing the behaviour, it's about changing the whole person's lifestyle. What's their meaning and purpose in life? Because if that's empty, then they're using substances or food or whatever it might be to fill that void. And so, the opposite of addiction isn't sobriety. The opposite is connection and meaning and purpose, and having those things in one's life. And what was the second part of the question?
I don't know. I'm going on, my head's gone down a thing. I was thinking about Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. I'm thinking about, having, like you're saying, a purpose, and thinking about Jung's work. But I was thinking about what I was saying about was that connectivity with the churches and lack of like community or sangha.
Oh yeah,
and this lack of like.
I think something that we're seeing in Australia, well, internationally, but also in Australia now too, is that connection is happening in different ways. I mean, we see it happen in a very unhelpful way, where you've got conspiracy theorists that all get together on Facebook and they've got connection. They're all connected, and they feel like that they've got this specialness that's bringing them all together. Through to with psychedelics, there's integration circles happening now that are sort of happening informally, where people come together as a community and talk about their experiences and try to integrate those in a community, if you like. So communities are starting to be being created here in Perth and over east, but it's been happening for some time now in North America and Europe, where people are able to come into these integration circles and be part of a community. And I think I guess where those two things intersect, the purpose and meaning and the lack of community in the integration circles, is something I also see as an adverse effect of psychedelic drug use. And Strassman actually wrote about this a long time ago, and I remember reading it going, I don't know what you're talking about. He said the biggest danger of psychedelics is narcissism. And I didn't really know what that meant, but now I've seen it. People who have a propensity for narcissism, so they're quite self-focused already and have quite a high perception of themselves and perceive others' beliefs to be of a lower value, often get quite caught up in the psychedelic experience, because it's almost like the psychedelic experience now becomes that purpose, meaning creating thing. And I see people that drinking ayahuasca 2 or 3 times a week. And,
really?
Yeah, seriously. And they want to tell me, that they know all the answers now, and they know the truth, and they come off a little bit unhinged. They come across a little unhinged. But when you tap down into it, it's actually really sad, because as you start to probe, they can't tell you what they're bringing back each time they go into that psychedelic experience, but they keep going back. Why do they keep going back? I think it's because they've found a community there, and now they're linked in with that ayahuasca drinking community, and they've dialed it up to 11, and they're doing it quite frequently, and in doing so believe that they're it's almost like a conspiracy theorist, where they believe that they are somehow connected to some higher order, purposeful, meaningful task by engaging in this, ayahuasca drinking on a frequent basis.
But do you think that's really interesting? But do you think that happens in groups anywhere? So, for example, do you think that happens in yoga groups? Does it happen in meditation groups? There's always someone who's a little bit more spiritual than the other person, has the better beads, who has the better robe, who walks with a more graceful presence into the room, And I've been on meditation retreats where I've seen this, or the director of the meditating instructor will open up sometimes for questions, and you can see people just chomping at the bit to get out how spiritual they are and the deep, meaningful question about veganism and saving the planet, and you think, fuck me, just chill out, man.
It's exactly the same process where people, I don't think any of these practices, using psychedelics, ayahuasca, meditation, yoga, none of these things seem to be particularly helpful for people that already have that particular personality and disposition, because they go in at 110%. And then there's almost, as you say, I'm more spiritual than you are, or how long have you done a retreat for? Oh, only 4 days. I've done one for 2 years. It's almost like this dick sizing that goes on in people's spirituality. So it's definitely not confined to psychedelics. It's across contemplative methods that are designed to induce altered states of consciousness.
It's interesting, because I've seen that in yoga, when I practice yoga at different studios, and I predominantly just practice yoga now at home just because of ease and time and coronavirus stuff, and I recently got a bigger place, so I have the space, and online platforms now are so good for doing yoga at home and meditation. But I've also seen it in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, in martial arts. So I've been doing martial arts for the guts of probably 16, 17 years, and it's really interesting because, I run a consulting business, do this podcast, I do research, I like to do long distance swimming, I do jiu-jitsu, so I got lots of different interests, right? So I have to integrate everything to help me on a journey of whatever it might be. So I can't be kind of very focused on one thing, and that's just my nature. I like different interests. But it's funny when you see somebody come into jiu-jitsu who may have not done some other sport, or may have done another sport, and then they become this within 2 years to get their blue belt. They're quite good. They might have had some success at competitions, and they become this nearly very preachy person about they watch something on YouTube, or they're following some other instructor stuff online. And I've never seen it in any other sport, but only in jiu-jitsu, and then they'll walk in with that presence of the world champ. But it's very interesting. I see it in yoga and meditation, and I see it in jiu-jitsu. So it's funny how certain groups will have that kind of I'm better than you within that group as well, which again, it feeds into what you were saying about that narcissism. It's really, I never thought about that. It's really interesting.
Yeah, I think on top of that, with things like jiu-jitsu and other, let's call it just sports, depends how you define sport, but because I define it as something quite broad. There's also a group of people that aren't necessarily narcissistic, but they really go above and beyond with whatever they do in life. They always 120%.
Yeah, train 7 times a week or instead of like 2 or 3. Yeah.
And so you see that quite a lot in meditation and things as well. It's not coming from a place of I'm better than you. It's coming from a place where this person really pushes themselves to the limits. You see it a lot of in extreme sports as well, adrenaline sports, where people are really pushing it to the nth degree to because essentially I think people that are drawn to these sports are often sensation-seeking risk takers, and I think that converges nicely. To me, that's Joe Rogan. He's a sensation-seeking risk taker, and that's kind of synthesized with his interest in psychedelics, and he's just become full on with psychedelics as well. I mean, he's probably a bit narcissistic on there. I
don't think so, Steve. No, I don't think so. No.
but you can see where it all sort of interfaces. All these different parts of ourselves interface. And you see it not only in the way people talk about psychedelics or meditation or yoga, but also jiu-jitsu and surfing, kite surfing.
That's right. Yeah.
Jumping out of a plane.
Yeah. I find it interesting, like the whole Joe Rogan phenomenon, because people come up to you and say like, oh yeah, you should do jiu-jitsu, lift weights, hot yoga, do some running, do this, do that, get on growth hormone, take TRT, do this, blah, blah, blah. And then they go, how do you think I should do that? Because like you've got a PhD in the kind of performance area. I'm like, you can't do all that. How come Rogan does it? He hasn't got a fucking full-time job and he's rich. That's how he does it. And I guarantee you, he's not doing all of those things every single day. So like, believe less of what you hear and more of what you see, Because it's easy for people to talk shit, me included. But, we're not running around every day doing everything.
And the other thing is, of course, with something like Joe Rogan, and there's lots of other people out in the podcast world that are getting a lot of streams, and they're making money out of it. They're advertising products. So, of course, Joe's going to talk about all these different products. They're sending them to him and paying him to talk about them. Yeah,
and he had a supplement company himself, which he was spruiking as well. So, that's... Right, Steve, I'm going to just change tact a little bit. I want to delve into this research paper that you had published recently on the microdosing, because it is really interesting, and it kind of summarizes or brings together some of the things we've been talking about. So in this group, you had 339 participants, 131 of them. So that's very high numbers, by the way, for anybody listening. This is the numbers here. I had to kind of zoom in and go 339, not 33.9. I was like, no, it's definitely a lot of people. You had 131 people that were doing yoga. So when they were doing yoga, how would you define yoga? Is this doing the asanas, like the actual movements, or is it meditation?
It had to include both.
Oh, okay.
And I think what was really interesting about this study was it was done by the idea came from a student, and I said, let's work together and we'll come up with a way of looking at what you want to look at. And what we didn't expect was that we would find people who are doing yoga and microdosing. We weren't expecting that. And so that was for me, that was the most interesting part of that research. I think one of the difficulty with these sorts of studies is while we might get a large sample size, the data's collected online. So we're getting people to complete surveys. So we can't guarantee that everybody who is saying they're doing yoga is actually doing yoga. It's one of the limitations, and so the research with microdosing now is moving down the same path as psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, where there was recently a study in the UK where they got people to be their own blinding agent, if you like. So they got sent a bunch of QR codes that they printed out, and they had to make up their placebo capsules and their microdosing capsules, and they put QR codes on them all, and then they'd get sent each day from the university the QR code, and it'd tell them which one to take, and that way they were able to put people into a placebo group and the microdosing group, and they actually didn't find any significant differences really between the two groups, which highlights the role of expectancy and something that we can't control for in these sorts of studies. So, even with yoga, if you compare yoga with a control group, the people with yoga may report better well-being, but that's because they're expecting to have better well-being because they're doing all this yoga work. It's really hard to control for the expectancy effect or the placebo effect. And that's where the research is really going at the moment. And it becomes even more difficult when we're working with drugs like MDMA at solid doses. 120 milligrams of MDMA is the usual dose we give somebody with PTSD. And it's pretty clear within half an hour whether somebody got a placebo or MDMA. One, their pupils are dilated, their blood pressure's gone up.
There's physiological markers you can measure.
So the patient knows, the clinicians know. It's very difficult to blind, and so a big topic at the moment in this field is trying to figure out ways of creating better blinds. And so we've just put in for a government grant to look at a potential blind for MDMA using dextromethorphan, which is found in cough syrup, but we're going to give people a large dose of it, which would dilate their pupils, and it would mean that they get a subjective experience that's a little bit like ketamine. But if they haven't had MDMA before, they're going to know that they've had something. So there's something on board, and we're trying to control for that issue with placebo. And there's microdosing research happening with one of my co-authors from a recent paper on microdosing. Vince Polito's doing a similar study, but he's actually getting people, a bit like the study in the UK where they got people to be their own RCT controller, randomise themselves. He's using that same idea, but then bringing people into the lab and getting them to do computer tests to see whether there are differences in cognition and performance.
Yeah, so very objective.
Yeah, trying to really step it up to figure out what's going on here. Is this about expectancy and placebo, or is this about the microdose itself? And with macrodosing, is it about the person, in the placebo condition? I mean, I know if I had PTSD and I was participating in this radical new innovative treatment, and I knew half an hour in that I got given the placebo, then I'd probably be feeling pretty shit. And there's a documentary recently on BBC that looked at comparing psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy with escitalopram, which is an SSRI medication. And the people in the placebo condition actually said this in the documentary. They said they knew that they didn't get the psilocybin, so they must be on the escitalopram, and they were disappointed. And so we need to figure out how to enhance our research methodology to be able to reduce the impact of those expectancy effects.
Yeah, it's interesting because when I read this study here, like I said, you had 131 doing yoga, 69 doing microdosing, 54 doing microdosing and yoga, and then 85 in a control group, which I presume just did nothing.
Yeah, the control group were actually recruited from Amazon through an Amazon recruitment system where people sign up to say they want to do surveys, so they would. So it only got sent out to people that said that they didn't know anything about psychedelics and they don't do yoga.
And it was interesting because, like, with the results, you found that the yoga and microdosing group scored significantly higher on psychological well-being and absorption than did the control, and absorption being this openness to altered states. The microdosing and yoga group had lower depression scores in the microdosing only group, lower anxiety. But what was interesting was, and I wrote this here, I was looking at this last night, was about was a higher levels of anxiety in the yoga group already from baseline. So are people with the higher levels of anxiety inherently doing these things to kind of take the edge off anyway? So it's kind of hard to measure the improvement because they might be at a high level already of, a high level or a lower level of anxiety due to this built-up tolerance of yoga long-term, we'll say.
And that is actually another methodological limitation of this particular study, is that we can't draw causation. We don't know if people with high levels of anxiety are more drawn towards engaging in yoga, or people with depression are more likely to be drawn towards engaging in microdosing. We don't know what's causing. We can't draw causation. We can only look at the correlations that are occurring. And similarly with absorption, it may be that microdosing and yoga increase people's level of absorption, or it may be that they're more attracted to engaging in those contemplative practices because they work better for them. People who are high in absorption will find it easier to get into a deep meditative state or a hypnotic state, or have a deeper psychedelic experience as well. So people with those traits might be more drawn to it, or engaging in that activity over time might lead to increased absorption. And we don't know the answers to some of these questions. One of the questions we set out to look at most recently was neuroticism, because one of the earliest pieces of research done on microdosing in Australia was by my colleague Vince Polito over at Macquarie. And he found that using a 2 point, time point 1, time point 2, he found at time point 2, people microdosing had higher levels of neuroticism, the personality trait, than when they started. And so that seemed very strange. And so we went and tried to replicate that, and we didn't find the finding, possibly because we were looking at a slightly different group of microdoses. His original study, looked at people that were pretty much microdose naive, whereas people that have been microdosing for some time, they may have become more aware of any sort of free-floating anxiety that comes with microdosing. They may have already become more aware of their own emotions. So at time point 1 with experienced microdoses, that it might already be a little higher on neuroticism than the general population. But at time point 2, we didn't see any increase.
Any change,
And another reason for that might be, I guess, how we've tried to pull this all together at the moment in terms of the research that we've done in Australia, is that maybe based on the study that we've been talking about, maybe adding in a contemplative practice is protective because it provides people with a way of managing some of the anxiety that might come with microdosing, even though it's not meant to have a subjective effect. Often there will be some, physical effects. You're not tripping, but people do have physiological effects to the point. I'm just trying to think how to anonymize this as much as I can. I had somebody approach me, 2 years ago, that I knew quite well. They were providing me with so it's a colleague, and they were providing me with a USB. And we're just having a bit of a chat just over in the corridor there. And I said, gee, your pupils are dilated. Have you been on the pingers? And she said to me, can you tell? I said, well, I can now. What have you been up to? And she said, I've been microdosing. I said, well, you're taking too much because your pupils are dilated. Try dropping your dose down.
Stephen, a lot of people might be listening to this going, oh, this is irresponsible. These people are talking here about research and they're kind of laughing about it in the psychedelics and the drugs. Drugs are bad. All you got to do is walk down the middle of a city and see people sitting on the side of the street from drug use. And, these guys are talking about doing research in this area. To use the old South Park quote, drugs are bad, okay? What would you say to people like that who are really against opening up drug research in Australia?
Well, the first thing I'd say is look at alcohol, which causes more harm to Australians
than any other drug. How dare you, Stephen? How dare you?
Tobacco comes in at second. When drugs are ranked on their potential for toxicity, dependence, psychedelics and MDMA are ranked very, very low. Look, methamphetamine's not a great drug, but when we compare alcohol, methamphetamine, tobacco to drugs like LSD, nobody has ever died from an overdose of LSD. It's not toxic in that way. There's a famous published case study from the early 70s where I think about 8 people in LA found a plate with some white powder on it. They're having a dinner party. They assumed it was cocaine. It was LSD. They all had 10,000 doses each. They were in hospital about 2 hours later, discharged the next morning with no ill effects. Had that been any other drug, they'd all be dead.
Jesus.
LSD, psychedelics cannot cause dependence. So if if I give you a dose of LSD today and I give you the same dose tomorrow, nothing will happen tomorrow. So you need to sort of double, triple, quadruple the dose. So I give you 4 doses tomorrow and then 16 doses. Well, you just can't keep that up. So people don't become physiologically dependent. Like we talked about earlier, people become psychologically dependent and go in for those experiences probably more frequently than they need to. But there's no evidence of for physiological dependence, and in fact, it's almost like a fail safe in that you just can't keep dosing. It doesn't work. You're wasting LSD and you're wasting the money you spent to buy the LSD. So it's kind of got this fail safe to it. And finally, it doesn't have. None of the classic psychedelics have any chronic toxicity, so they don't cause any long-term diseases. So, if we look at alcohol, it's carcinogenic, neurotoxic, hepatotoxic. There's so many diseases I could reel off that alcohol causes. Whereas
not to mention the deaths from alcoholism.
Yeah, and then with mescaline, psilocybin, LSD, we don't see any of those problems. With MDMA, some people are still worried about the potential of neurotoxicity, but it's the jury's still out on that, and we're very careful in the way that we recruit people into our studies. We won't take people who have used ecstasy on 20 or more occasions, just in case it does have that neurotoxic potential, but. Compared to the legal drugs we have in society, the drugs that we're talking about here are far less harmful.
Yeah, you know Carl Hart. Have you read his work? Same thing as well. I was having a chat with my neighbour actually last week about the differences, because I don't drink anymore, and he was like, "No, you having a glass of wine?" I was like, "No, I couldn't be bothered with it." And he's like, "Do you take drugs?" I was like, "No." No, I don't know what you do. Like, we're just.
What's wrong with you?
Yeah, what's wrong with you? Yeah, I got lots of money now. Hence why I live beside you. We were just talking about that, and then we're kind of on this bit of a conversation. And I was actually talking about Carl Hart's work to him about how many people die from heroin versus, alcohol, and he had this expectation, or he had this. Misnomer that there was thousands of people die of heroin every year, and so there's no actual, from people withdrawn from heroin, Carl Hart talks about, there's actually no deaths from it, but alcohol, like thousands upon thousands of deaths from alcoholism. And if you have to detox people from alcohol, you have to bring them into a hospital, you have to do it very, very carefully, you have to step people down. But heroin, you can do cold turkey and be off for like in 2 weeks.
Yeah, it's unpleasant. Withdrawal from unpleasant, but it's not going to kill you. Having worked in hospitals for 15, nearly 20 years, when people come through the front door, one of the first things we're looking for is signs of alcohol withdrawal, because in hospitals around Australia, a number of people have died because they haven't picked up on the alcohol withdrawal. They've gone into delirium tremens and jumped off a roof, or gone into an epileptic seizure and died. And so hospitals now are at every point are looking at people and they're asking them how often do you drink, asking those questions frequently. But in addition to that, because we know people underreport, they're looking for signs and symptoms of alcohol withdrawal so they can get in and start treating it early with diazepam or Valium, so that people don't die in hospitals from alcohol.
What happens to people, as a side note? Do you know, we were talking about this a few weeks ago. We're watching a show in England about emergency services. When people are alcoholics like that or coming down, what happens when they go to prison or get arrested? How do they manage that?
They put them on diazepam withdrawal, so they take them off alcohol using diazepam and then slowly reduce the diazepam.
So same process.
Process that you do in a hospital. Okay. And often these days we do the detoxes for people in their home. Like if we think that if the person's got support around them, they don't need to do it in a hospital. They'll get a nurse that might drop in every 3 days and bring the next 3 day supply of Valium with them, and the person can actually do that detox at home. But the issue being, of course, like you're saying, people die from there's not many drugs for which a dependence is created that if the person is to cease using causes death. Alcohol is one of the few drugs that do that. And heroin, I try to avoid talking about heroin in these sorts of conversations because it does have a lot of sort of negative negative perceptions. When you look at, well, one, we don't see a lot of heroin deaths in Australia because people don't use heroin much in Australia. People use cocaine, MDMA. Of course, cannabis is the most frequently used illicit drug, but then cocaine, MDMA, and then it starts to get a bit messy in terms of who uses what. But we don't see a lot of heroin use, and heroin is actually diacetylmorphine. It's a slight tweak of the morphine chemical. Diacetylmorphine is used in London hospitals. So if you go to a London hospital and you've had an accident, they give you heroin. They don't call it heroin, they call it diacetylmorphine. And it's used because it's a very good painkiller. Australia banned, again, a lot of this stuff is historical, and it's a historical quirk. So in Australia, the reason we don't have diacetylmorphine in our hospitals, we use fentanyl instead, which is probably a lot stronger. But the reason we don't use diacetylmorphine is because in the 1950s, Australia had the highest per capita rate of heroin use in the world.
Really?
From cough syrups and all of the things you could buy in the pharmacy. And so we just outright banned it. And so in turn, it means that we can't use diacetylmorphine as a medicine. Other countries use it as a medicine. With people in Switzerland and a number of European states where they develop problems with illicit use of heroin, one of the treatments is to put them on heroin. They just give them pharmaceutical grade diacetylmorphine. And what you end up,
Switzerland and Portugal do that.
Yeah, there's a number of countries now that are doing it. It's called heroin assisted treatment. And it's not used as the first line of treatment. Methadone, buprenorphine, and other psychotherapies are used first. But if the person's not responding, this is sort of a backup. And what they find is people that are provided with the treatment end up becoming productive members of society. They don't, and some of them then decrease their use of heroin. Once, if you're not having to think about where you're going to get heroin all the time and how you're going to source that and where your next hit's coming from, because it's coming from your GP, people are able to re-engage in society, get a job, and start paying taxes. And so they become productive members of society. Heroin itself is not toxic to any organ in the body. It's not a particularly nasty drug. I mean, the main problem with heroin is quality control. The reason people die from heroin is there's no quality control. This batch might be 6 times stronger than this batch, and until you try it, you don't know that.
That's the case for legalization, isn't it?
Yeah.
Which we've seen in Switzerland and Portugal, where the numbers go down, because with the legalization, you can provide treatment around those areas. You can bring people to a central point. You can then provide them with education, connectivity, treatment, and the rates are like astonishing. I remember listening to a BBC World, like on the radio documentary about it, and it was unbelievable. Like, and I started looking at some of the literature on it, reading Carl Hart's work, and it's like, why aren't we doing this? You think to yourself, when you look at it as a scientist, you think, this is just crazy that we're not doing this. But the problem is that it's this social idea of what's good and what's bad. And like you said, alcohol and cigarettes is kind of tick the box because it's the government, it's okay, that's not bad. But heroin, other things like that, if we open it up, people have this idea that everybody's going to be walking around stoned and off their head the whole time. I'm like, well, look at Holland. People aren't walking around tripping 99% of the time. I got a few Dutch mates, and they're like, if you're walking around tripping like that the whole time and high, people just look at you like you're an alcoholic in Australia. Like, look at that fucking idiot, just constantly drunk, constantly high. It's the same kind of thing, you know? And
having been there, most of the people smoking pot in the Netherlands are tourists.
Exactly.
They're not the locals.
Yeah.
The locals are like, oh, why would I want to do that? You know? That's just it's like it's available. It's there, but I've tried it.
Yeah,
I don't need to do that again. And all the tourists flood over, and they're the ones that are buying all the cannabis in the Netherlands and the truffles.
We were laughing because the last time before the coronavirus, myself and my wife were in Europe, and we were walking around Amsterdam, and the same thing as what you said. It was all English guys screaming in the windows of the brothels, and it was Americans falling out of smoking shops. And I was like, this is bizarre. This is just really funny. Steve, the last point is you wrote an editorial, I think, recently, or a piece on Australia should be initiating a psychedelic research program. What are the barriers? Yourself, Nigel Strauss, yourself, and Martin Williams. And this made me actually think about some of the research that's come out of UWA recently in the Centre for Sleep with Jen Walsh. They've actually been looking at the effects or the benefits of CBD on insomnia. And I think, would it be fair to say that maybe cannabis could be the Trojan horse to get the rest of these things opened up for legalization?
Oh, absolutely. Look, the US is a classic example of how this has happened. So in 1996, California was the first state to move to medical cannabis. And now, how many states I'm losing count of how many states in the US have recreational access to cannabis. Yeah. So through medical use, it creates a change in the way people see the substances, and that then creates a window of policy opportunity to then regulate the market, because it's far better to have a regulated market where we have quality control. We can regulate advertising. We can regulate where the taxes from that goes. And the government's actually, instead of the government spending billions of dollars trying to protect it coming in, produce it locally and tax it, and that then creates revenue for government. So it absolutely is. I've never heard it called a Trojan horse, but it's definitely the pathway to recreation is medicalization, in my opinion.
Yeah, because I think I had that same reflection, because I was in Denver in sort of around 2012, and Denver, the city, had lots of derelict buildings. It wasn't really that great downtown around Denver. It was nice parts, but there's parts that were quite derelict when you drive around. Then I went back the next year after it was being legalized, and I was like, what's happened here? Like, you could really start the difference. You could really start seeing the difference that it was making. And then I was talking to a friend of mine a few years ago, maybe about 2016, 17, who was in the US, and he said Denver's just gone through the roof. Like, all those old warehouses that you saw, that's all now people growing, it's stuff flooding into the city, lots of people coming in. Violent crime was way down as well. Like, all these benefits, that have happened in around the city of Denver. So the case for it is really there,
The case, for me, it's not a question of whether or not we should regulate cannabis. It's a question of which model is the best model to regulate. And I actually don't like the Colorado model. To me, that's too capitalistic.
It's high tax on it, massive tax on it.
Well, it's also, but they're allowed to advertise. They basically have free reign. I think if you're going to regulate a drug, you start with the most regulation, because it's easier to down-regulate, to turn the dial down on the regulation. Look at alcohol and tobacco and how much we fought to turn up the dial on regulation. And so Washington State is a good comparator of Colorado, because the reason for they legalized at the same time, but the reasons were quite different. For Colorado, it was about bringing money into the state coffers and putting it into education and health and these sorts of things. In Washington, it was led by the CWA, the Country Women's Association. Oh, really? They were concerned that what their argument was that if we sell young people cannabis from a store, they don't have to go to a drug dealer and they won't be exposed to other drugs. And so the model is quite different. It's more subtle in Washington. There's less advertising. There's less products available. It's less about making money. And the reason I bring this up is because I can see this already happening now in the psychedelic space. You've got multinational companies setting up, getting ready for this next wave of money-making opportunity. So Compass Pathways have patented a pathway to synthesize psilocybin. They floated on the ASX, on the International Stock Exchange, and I think they raised nearly $500 million, and they don't own anything. They own a couple of patents, and they're running some clinical trials. There's Atsy Life Sciences. There's all these companies that are now floating on the stock exchange. And to me, it's being driven by this hype I was talking about earlier, where there's all this positive talk going on, but it's a bubble that's going to burst, because they don't have $500 million worth of assets. So eventually that's going to crumble down. But what it's creating in the meantime is a lot of competition. It's at the moment, it feels like it's a race to the bottom to get the intellectual property and patent as much as possible, because that's your company. Your company is based on the idea that we've patented all these things and we're going to make money out of them.
Well, if you see big companies like that coming after it, Steve, something's coming. It's definitely going to be. Well,
it's the other thing that keeps me awake at night, because these companies aren't interested in patient well-being. They are interested in making money, and so if we get to a position where these become medicines in Australia and we let these companies come over, they're no different than big pharma. They're big. They're big psych. A term's someone's come up with a term that I really like. Corporadelics. They're corporadelic organisations and companies that are coming in, and they're just here to make money. They're not here to they don't care about the welfare of people. They just see this as the next big thing, and I'm seeing it. Even in Australia, cannabis companies in Australia are already pivoting. They're getting ready for this now. And that freaks me out because, again, that means we end up with a model where the people who need the treatments the most won't be able to get them because it's going to be all about making money. And those that get the treatments may not get the gold standard because people are going to cut costs to be able to make money.
There you go. There's our hot tip for the stock exchange this week.
don't buy stock. I'm a psychologist, not a financial advisor, but even so, I would not buy stock in a psychedelic corporation at the moment.
You might get a nice t-shirt over. Stephen, thanks very much. If people want to follow your work, how do they follow your work? How do they get in contact? What channels are you on where people can argue with you?
Yeah, look, I'm not huge on social media, but I am fairly active on Twitter, and my handle is at Stephen with a PH, J Bright, BRIGHT. That's a good way to interact with me on a public forum. I don't do Facebook. I run a lot of Facebook research. I think that's why I'm not on Facebook, because I do too much research on it.
I'm getting off it soon.
Professionals. I do use LinkedIn. Yeah. I don't post a lot on LinkedIn, but I use it as a way to connect with people. And to be honest, I'm not particularly hard to find on the internet. Just Google my name and ECU and you'll find an email address.
Yeah, we'll put some links in there for your research papers as well, which people can access. So, yeah, great conversation, Stephen. I'm sure we'll talk again. There's lots of overlap and I really enjoyed it. So thanks very much.
Thanks for having me.